So thank you everyone for joining us today. This is one of our first author talks that we've hosted on this platform, so we are very excited. We've had over 225 people register for today's talk, which is a phenomenal turnout for our events. So thank you, everybody. People will continue to join as the meeting goes along, but I just wanted to introduce myself and my colleague, Colleen Schreiner. We are hosting today's talk with Dr. Julie Suk, and we both work for the Alice Paul Institute. I am the Outreach and Civic Engagement Director, and Colleen is our Operations Director. And she and I will be here to answer any questions. Due to the large number of participants, we are only going to take questions through the chat window. So please hop over there, introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling in from today, and then ask any questions through that platform. And Colleen and I will be monitoring the chat window for any questions. If we don't get to your question, don't fear. The Advocacy Committee of the Alice Paul Institute will be sending an email out later this week to answer any questions that we weren't able to address during today's chat. So a little bit about the Alice Paul Institute. We are a nonprofit organization based in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. I think most of our guests might have heard of us or visited Paulsdale, which is where we are headquartered, which is Alice Paul's childhood home, where she was born in 1885. In the early 1990s, a wonderful group of women decided to raise a lot of money and purchase a very large piece of land and a beautiful old farmhouse and restore it. And that is where we are headquartered today. We are open during non-pandemic hours. We are open for tours, and we hope that each of you will be able to find a way to come visit us in New Jersey. If you are not able, please head over to our YouTube channel. We are just launching a brand new series of virtual guided tours by two of our amazing other staff members, Erin and Tane. So please take a look at our YouTube channel. And definitely follow us on all of our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you'll be able to hear out a lot about what we're doing these days. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Julie Suk. And Dr. Julie Suk is the author of a new book that's coming out called We the Women, Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. Sorry, I had a couple messages that panic people popping up on my screen, so I got distracted. And so it's going to come out in August, and you can pre-order your copy today via Amazon. I highly encourage you to do that. I've placed my order already. And we're going to learn today about the women lawmakers and other women in the field that helped make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment could advance towards the states for ratification. So Julie's going to give us a great introduction to the women who we have, the unspoken heroes that we might not have ever heard of before. She is a frequent commentator in the media, in the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, and her research is very consistently cited in different cases to advance the Equal Rights Amendment. So I would love to introduce Julie Suk at this time. I'm going to find Julie's.
Hi.
You there? I'm trying to get you. There we are. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Krista. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I'm really delighted to have the invitation to talk to you about my forthcoming book. And I'm grateful to you and Lucy Beard and the Alice Paul Institute for continuing to host this event, even though everyone will now have to be joining from home rather than in person at the Alice Paul Institute. But I do see that we're able to talk to so many people from all over the country as a result of moving the event online. So I'm delighted to have so many people from so many different places be able to join today. So I've actually prepared some slides because the focus of my book is the women lawmakers and lawyers who gave meaning to the Equal Rights Amendment over a century and more. And I think it's sometimes helpful to see the images of these women and to see their own words, which I'll be talking about and which I discuss and tell narratively throughout the book. So let me do that, get the slides up. Great. So as Krista mentioned, my book will be out in August 2020, and it tells the stories of the women lawmakers who fought for the Equal Rights Amendment. And the primary contention of the book is that adding the amendment to the Constitution today would first and foremost recognize these women as founding mothers of our nation's fundamental law. We have founding fathers who are revered, but because of the Constitution's history and the difficulty of amending the Constitution, we actually don't have any pieces of constitutional text that were written by women, adopted by women in Congress, ratified by women in state legislatures, given meaning by women lawyers. And finishing the ratification of the ERA would allow that to happen, the eventuality that we actually have founding mothers as well as founding fathers. And I think that's the most important argument, amongst others, other political and legal arguments for having an Equal Rights Amendment. And because we are at the Alice Paul Institute, I am going to begin with Alice Paul. That's Alice Paul in 1920, in August 1920, after Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. At the time, 36 was the magic number. That's the number of states you needed to add an amendment to the US Constitution. And that is the flag that she's unfurling, the National Woman's Party. And each of the stars on that flag represents a state that ratified the amendment. They had 36, and she unfurled that from the balcony, and you see all the women of the National Woman's Party looking on at the end of a very long, hard fight. Alice Paul certainly took the victory as personal as well as political, because she had endured force feedings and jail time and other difficulties to get the suffrage amendment passed in August 1920. So this was the end of a long, hard struggle. But Alice Paul, along with others in the National Woman's Party, did not think of this as the end of the fight, but rather a new beginning. If you look at this picture here, that's Alice Paul. Because she did think very personally about the struggle for suffrage, it was well known that she actually sewed each of those ratification stars onto the flag herself. And this is a famous picture of her doing that. And she's accompanied by various colleagues in the National Woman's Party. And you'll notice the woman who's standing in the center, hovering over her and looking on, is Crystal Eastman. And Crystal Eastman is also a very important figure in the story of the Equal Rights Amendment. Crystal Eastman was a drafter, along with Alice Paul, of the original Equal Rights Amendment, which was first introduced in Congress in 1923. And they really went to work on the Equal Rights Amendment immediately after the suffrage amendment went into effect, because they believed that this was only the beginning. Now at last we could begin. That's what Crystal Eastman wrote in 1920. And both Crystal Eastman and Alice Paul believed that in addition to the vote, women needed to have equal rights in all other aspects of life, particularly equal rights in matters that would lead to women's economic independence. At the time, many states had laws that excluded women from certain professions, and that made it difficult for married women to own their own property and access their own earnings, even if they worked outside of the home. So the combination of these things made women dependent in the eyes of the law. And that was the primary thing that the Equal Rights Amendment was designed to fix. And although Alice Paul was the great strategist, you could think of Crystal Eastman as giving intellectual, legal content to what the Equal Rights Amendment was about. She thought that it would be really important to get rid of any existing state laws, and certainly some of them were changing anyway. But the idea was to have a constitutional amendment to get rid of any state laws that discriminated against women, federal and state laws that discriminated against women in ways that kept them excluded from or inferior in economic opportunity. And so they designed this amendment to do just that. For Crystal Eastman, she was a lawyer. She had graduated at the very top of her class at NYU Law School over a decade before the suffrage amendment was ratified. She also believed that the Equal Rights Amendment would help women working in industry. She had in fact written a path-breaking book on workers' compensation and had a lot of experience with women workers. And Crystal Eastman believed that whatever protections women workers had would be extended to male workers under the Equal Rights Amendment. But one of the reasons, although there are many, one of the reasons the Equal Rights Amendment did not really get off the ground in the 1920s or the 1930s was that there was some division amongst feminists, amongst the women who fought and united for suffrage about the question of labor protections for women only. That is, if you look now at what the Equal Rights Amendment said when it was first introduced in Congress in 1923, and that text has been changed over the last century to say something else, slightly different, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the idea that men and women should have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction, it raised this question as to what would happen about laws that gave protections to women workers only, minimum wage laws that were for women only, maximum hours laws for women only. And I think to us standing in the 21st century, it may seem kind of patronizing that only women got protected. But back then, there were some women who identified as proponents of women's equality that were very uneasy about the Equal Rights Amendment, and they were uneasy about it because they were being realistic about the judicial context in which they lived. That is, we had a Supreme Court that was very conservative at the time, and the Supreme Court had been striking down laws that protected workers. So anything on maximum hours struck down based on the worker's freedom of contract, the worker's freedom to choose to work 100 hours a week, and so forth. So the Supreme Court had been striking those down, and there were some feminists, including Florence Kelly, who thought that a good workaround would be to have laws that just protected women. And the Supreme Court was willing to uphold laws if they only protected women on the grounds that women were mothers, biologically and socially, and therefore might need the protections of the law. Of course, women did not have the vote before the 19th Amendment. So there was some understanding that if women didn't have the vote, and therefore also did not have much voice in politics, did not have much voice in labor unions, they would actually need legislation to protect them from exploitation because they did not have other means of doing so. So these were the kind of debates that led women to be ambivalent at best about the Equal Rights Amendment, although I think the main reason it really doesn't get off the ground at the time is that there are also very few women in Congress. There are very few women in positions of power. And so it's a combination of women lacking power and then women lacking power, meaning you have a conservative Supreme Court that takes a particular limiting view of labor rights, which then leads women who are trying to give shape to women's rights to divide over whether or not the ERA is desirable at that time. So for a while, from the 1920s, really until the ERA is adopted in 1972 by both houses of Congress, the ERA does not really have a serious chance of being adopted and ratified. There is a turning point, though, in the 1940s after World War II. The turning point has a lot to do with the fact that after World War II, and really dating back to after World War I, but certainly a wave after World War II, many, many countries around the world, particularly in Europe, are writing new constitutions that guarantee equal rights between women and men. And those equal rights amendments, essentially, do shape many women's views. Certainly women like Mary Church Terrell, an African-American woman who is a founding member of the National Association of Colored Women and a frequent participant in international women's conferences and the women's peace movement. They understand that there's a wave going around the world where the constitutional guarantee of equality between women and men is something that's widely accepted globally. And it's reflected in the UN Charter after World War II. And what's very interesting is that the constitutional guarantees that you see in European constitutions around the world really recognize that one of the things that really disadvantages women is their role as mothers, that especially after World War I and World War II, there's a recognition that women have to do both. They have to work and support their families. And if they're going to do that, they're going to be disadvantaged. And part of the job of laws on equality, whether it's constitutional equal rights or statutes on equality is to ensure that women are not disadvantaged because of their role in childbearing and child rearing. And you see that very strongly reflected in her comments at hearings of the House Judiciary Committee, a subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee, on the Equal Rights Amendment, where she says thousands of women are obliged to support themselves and their families, and the ERA can actually help the women in fulfilling those roles, right? And this is a very important point because nowadays, and I'm going to be jumping around between the present and the past, nowadays, and certainly in the 70s, I think that there was this myth created that the Equal Rights Amendment would be bad for mothers, that somehow the opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment have always had the best interests of mothers in mind. And that's actually not true. From Crystal Eastman to Mary Church Terrell, to many of the women who were involved in debating about the Equal Rights Amendment and pushing it through Congress in the 1970s, the disadvantaging effects of motherhood and the need for public policy solutions to motherhood was front and center and an important part of why it was important to have the Equal Rights Amendment. So if we fast forward a little bit, because throughout the 1950s, there is actually some more support for the Equal Rights Amendment, as reflected in the comments that Mary Church Terrell gives to Congress in the late 1940s. There's more of an understanding that the Equal Rights Amendment is compatible with ensuring the equality of mothers. But for a long time, the Equal Rights Amendment didn't really make it out onto the House floor for a debate or a vote. The Senate actually adopted it twice in the 1950s by the 2/3 majority, but it didn't really get anywhere in the House. And the reason it didn't get anywhere in the House was Emanuel Seller, who actually joined Congress in 1923, the year that the ERA was adopted. Emanuel Seller chaired the House Judiciary Committee from 1949 until 1972. And he made sure that the ERA did not get past the House Judiciary Committee. So even though there was growing support in Congress for the ERA, it just never got a debate. And so something extraordinary had to happen, and that something extraordinary was Martha Griffiths, a congresswoman from Michigan. She decided that she would lead a discharge petition. It's a little used parliamentary procedure which can get a committee to discharge, or rather it could discharge a bill from the committee's responsibility. If you get half of the House to sign your petition, then it can get a floor debate, even if the committee doesn't actually report it out to the floor. So this is how she got around Emanuel Seller. And when it actually got onto the House floor in August 1970, which was the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, there was actually an overwhelming majority vote. The Constitution says you need 2/3. They had well over 2/3. They had 96% of the vote in the House in favor of the ERA in 1970. And that was a very extraordinary thing. And I want to talk a little bit now about what some of the women proponents, there were only 10 women in the House in 1970 when the ERA first gets this overwhelming vote to be adopted by Congress. And this is when a lot of the women in Congress stake out their positions and their intellectual theories of what the ERA can and should do once it's added to the Constitution. And so many of the, who I'll call the mothers of the ERA, were women, extraordinary women. And before I go on, this is the text of the ERA that was adopted in 1972, slightly edited from the version that we saw from 1923. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Section 2, very importantly, gives Congress the power to enforce it. And Section 3 says that the ERA takes effect 2 years after the date of ratification. You'll notice what you don't see there in the text, but it was part of the resolution proposing it, was a 7-year deadline on ratification. And I want to note, though, that when Martha Griffiths did her discharge petition and got the ERA passed by such an overwhelming, over 90% majority of the House in 1970, that version did not have the deadline, and that's the version that many of the women in the House actually supported. So here you'll see Shirley Chisholm, who I think many of you may already be familiar with, and she's portrayed in the new TV miniseries, Mrs. America. And at least thus far, she's portrayed as someone who very historically ran an unsuccessful campaign for president in 1972. But of course, before that moment, she was a very important champion and mother of the Equal Rights Amendment. And on the floor in 1970, she said, this is the time to correct what the founding fathers professed but did not really fulfill. They professed equality of opportunity, but they only assured it to their sons and not to their daughters. So she says that on the House floor, and she points out there were no Black founding fathers, there were no founding mothers, a great pity on both accounts. It's not too late to complete the work they left undone. So she was a strong advocate, as was Patsy Mink. Patsy Mink was actually the first woman of color ever elected to Congress. She was a Japanese American woman from Hawaii. She had gone to law school at the University of Chicago, when very few women went to law school in the 1950s. And she also gave a lot of thought to what the ERA should do to the law. And she's also known as the mother of Title IX. Title IX hearings were going on at exactly the same time that ERA hearings were going on. And Mink actually believed that the ERA would not only strike down laws that discriminated by treating men and women differently, that it would also try to go Congress and state legislatures to pass new laws getting rid of practices that had a disparate impact on women. And also, very importantly, in response to some of the debates from the 1920s that were still going on at this time about whether ERA would strike down law that actually helped women by treating men and women differently, she believed, as did Shirley Chisholm, that any privileges that one sex already had would actually apply to both sexes equally. So if you had special rules that exempted women from overtime work, those rules would also apply to men if they were really actually helpful. If they were not helpful and they were actually just based on stereotypes, then the ERA would strike those down. And that was a very important part of the vision of the ERA. And it had very important implications also for what it would mean for mothers and housewives. And I want to also emphasize that when the ERA was passed in the 1970s, when it was debated in 1970 on Martha Griffiths' discharge petition, it was wholly bipartisan. There were Republican women like Florence Dwyer in the House who saw the ERA as getting rid of laws that excluded women from certain occupations and opportunities, but that did not mean that women would be taken out of the home. It did not mean that women could no longer be mothers or housewives if that's what in fact they wanted. She actually said on the House floor it would give new dignity to these important roles by confirming women's equality under the law, by upholding women's right to choose her place in society. The Equal Rights Amendment can only enhance the status of traditional women's occupations, for these would become positions accepted by women as equals, not roles imposed on them as inferiors. And she wasn't the only one. Margaret Heckler, who is also a lifelong proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment, also a Republican, she said on the House floor, "I do not have any desire to become one of the boys." And she also pointed out that many countries around the world actually did a lot on childcare that the United States did not do at that time. And unfortunately, the United States still does not do adequately today. But even 50 years ago, she said that there was childcare was a real issue that affected women's ability to be equal in the professions. And she mentioned things like leave for pregnancy, another problem that we continue to struggle with in the United States. And certainly then there was common ground between the Republicans and the Democrats on the need for support for working mothers. If you look at what Bella Abzug says, and this is, she actually joined the House after the 1970 vote in 1971, and she was there when the House voted again to adopt the ERA by significant majorities in 1971. But as she testified in favor of the ERA, she pointed out that millions of American women worked because they actually had to. And therefore, it was actually really important to think about universal childcare. And the fact that we didn't have universal childcare in the United States suggested some attitudes that were male thinking and potentially sexist. And I point to these quotes, that there's a much larger legislative record, but I point to them because it's really important to recognize that the founding mothers of the ERA were concerned with the ways in which motherhood made women unequal in society. And they were concerned with solutions that would make it easier for women to combine work and family, solutions like universal childcare, solutions like pregnancy leave. And they did not think that those solutions that focused on women's unique disadvantages would actually be incompatible with the Equal Rights Amendment. One thing I do want to say, because I think there's a lot of confusion in public debate about where the ERA deadline comes from. So as I mentioned, we had the House voting in 1970, in the same month of the suffrage 50th anniversary, to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, once the House adopted it, it went on to the Senate. And in the Senate in 1970, it ran into some problems, even though an overwhelming number of senators actually supported the ERA even in 1970. What happened was that Emanuel Seller, who had raised this in the House, but hadn't gotten anywhere raising it in the House, and Samuel Ervin in the Senate, who were ERA opponents, said, we can't pass this without a 7-year deadline on ratification. And it was really then, in the fall of 1970, that Samuel Ervin insisted on adding that deadline to the ERA bill. But that's not the only thing he added. And not a majority supported it. 35 senators supported it. That was enough because it was a majority of those present and voting. So they were able to add to the ERA at the time the 7-year deadline on ratification. They also added a provision allowing Congress to exempt women from the draft. And they added a provision that had nothing to do with the ERA. They added a provision that would guarantee prayer in public buildings, i.e. school prayer, the right to school prayer. And a lot of this was very opportunistic. The opponents of the ERA knew that if they just made a few little changes to the ERA, the effect of that would be to kill the ERA. Because just think about the timing. It's October, elections are 3 weeks away. If you change the ERA bill and you're the Senate, it means there's not going to be enough time before the end of the legislative session to reconcile the House and Senate versions. So it's a way of killing the ERA without taking responsibility for killing the ERA. You can pretend that you're improving the ERA by adding these little amendments, but then the Senate actually did not vote on the ERA itself. They changed it a bunch. And then elections happened, and then they were in a lame duck session, and then the ERA died in 1970, and then had to be reintroduced in 1971. And when it was reintroduced in 1971, Martha Griffiths testified, and she said, I put the 7-year deadline in this time in an effort to get broad support for the bill. She was worried that these very powerful and vocal minorities of men would send it to the legislative graveyard again. So she made what felt like a very small concession at the time. She fought off the more substantive changes that some of these opponents wanted. She made sure that the ERA that was reintroduced in 1971 did not have the provision allowing Congress to exempt women from the military draft. Certainly that school prayer provision was also gone in her version. But the 7-year deadline was something that I think, based on a political miscalculation, she agreed to. But it was really something that originated in these opponents insisting upon it, pretending to improve the bill. And neither Seller nor Irvin, who were the strongest proponents of the deadline, neither of them actually voted for the ERA, even with the deadline they wanted in place. They still voted against it. So, and I think that's also something important to know today as we evaluate the politics of the deadline and its meaning and its legitimacy. So one thing that I think is important to recognize is that what happens throughout the 1970s as the ERA, it did get adopted, of course, with the deadline in place by the House in 1971 and the Senate in 1972. But as making its way through the states for ratification, women lawyers were actually extremely resourceful and creative in taking everything that the ERA was supposed to be about and putting those arguments into their briefs for constitutional change under the 5th and 14th Amendments, both of which guarantee equal protection of the laws. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg, now Justice Ginsburg, was a very important figure in arguing major cases before the Supreme Court, including Frontiero versus Richardson, which struck down sex discriminatory laws. The first Supreme Court case that actually recognized sex discrimination as an equal protection problem was Reed versus Reed in 1971. And the timing of these cases is no coincidence. In fact, some of the Supreme Court justices in their opinions recognized the extent to which the movement for the ERA was shaping the way they understood the 5th and 14th Amendments of the existing Constitution. And it's really important. There are a lot of legal arguments, and I'm happy to get more into the state of the law in the question and answer. But it's really striking that in arguing Frontiero versus Richardson, which struck down a sex discriminatory law, Ginsburg said at the end of her oral argument, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks." And she did not invent those words herself. She was actually quoting a 19th century women's rights agitator, Sarah Grimke. And I point this out because so much of the development that you see on equal rights for women, whether it's through the ERA or through the 14th Amendment, is women standing on the shoulders of women who came before them and making legal meaning transgenerationally. And this is something that she was doing as well. Another very important lawyer who moved the agenda on bringing sex discrimination into the law of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment was Pauli Murray, who was a pioneering civil rights attorney. And she testified in 1970 to the Senate Judiciary Committee on the Equal Rights Amendment. And even though she was responsible for many of the legal theories that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to great success under the 14th Amendment, she still favored the Equal Rights Amendment because she thought that it could add something and it could bring a focus to equal power as well as equal rights. That is, the 14th Amendment was adopted before these questions of women's empowerment were actually at the forefront. But in the 1970s, Pauli Murray suggested that the opponents most feared equal power by women, not just equal rights. And the underlying issue of equal rights is an issue of power. And she pointed out that no group in power actually surrenders it without a struggle. And so one of the things she brought attention to in her testimony about the ERA was the fact that Congress was severely imbalanced. And it remains imbalanced today. Now, I mentioned that in 1970, there were only 10 women in Congress. And even when the ERA gets adopted in 1972, there's a handful more. It's 2.4% of Congress. And today, I think we're proud that as of 2018, we're at an all-time high of women in Congress. But that all-time high is still 23.7%. And I think we should be proud of the progress that has been made over time. But let me just point out that 23.7% is still not enough to make a constitutional amendment for sure, and very troublingly, not even enough to block a constitutional amendment. Now, let me explain. Article 5 of the US Constitution says that you need both houses of Congress, 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Think about it. If women are less than 1/3, it makes it at least mathematically possible for men in Congress to pass an amendment without ever talking to any female colleague, without ever considering what her vote might be. And I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but I'm saying the fact that it's possible suggests that we're in what Pauli Murray would call a dangerous imbalance in our democracy, something that's not really compatible with the ideal of democracy that we have. And so Pauli Murray pointed out that the Equal Rights Amendment was not just about what would happen to the law, whether you use the 14th Amendment or the 5th Amendment, but it was fundamentally about having something in the Constitution that would signal a commitment to equal power. No, we're not being Zoom bombed. That is a slide that I added because I also want to point out, I mean, this is an important part of the story, and I think it's a part of the story that unfortunately I find talking to young people, and in my own experience growing up after the Equal Rights Amendment deadline in 1982 passed, that Phyllis Schlafly is probably the name and face that most people can associate with the ERA, rather than some of the other women in our story. And of course, she was extremely influential, although I argue that it really wasn't Schlafly who single-handedly killed the Equal Rights Amendment. I think the Equal Rights Amendment's prospects were compromised, if not poisoned from the beginning, by Emanuel Seller and Sam Ervin when they put that deadline into the amendment, which was then put into the version that made its way through Congress. So Phyllis Schlafly had a very powerful Stop ERA movement, and the Stop ERA movement was successful in part because they created a picture of the ERA as something that would go against American motherhood. And I think that was a very false vision of the ERA. If you look at the words of the ERA's proponents in Congress, it was very clear that they wanted the laws to ensure that women were not disadvantaged because they were mothers. And it meant that the law could treat women and men differently in certain circumstances for the purposes of overcoming disadvantage. But unfortunately, there was a lot of misinformation about what the ERA would actually do. Phyllis Schlafly claimed that women would not have any protections under the law, that they would lose alimony, that they could not have, and actually this is an argument that's continuing to be made today. I just read in the Washington Post yesterday that opponents of the ERA are saying that pregnant women can't get accommodations in the workplace if we get an ERA. Which is actually the opposite of the truth. But in any case, there was certainly a lot of misinformation where Phyllis Schlafly claimed the ERA would lead to men and women always being treated the same, no matter what, under all circumstances, even if it disadvantaged women. And I think that misinformation slowed down the momentum on the Equal Rights Amendment. And so by the time you get to 1977, there were only 35 ratifications, and you need 38 to get to 3/4 of the states. And that's when women in Congress, and there was a larger number by this point, women in Congress started to lead the effort to extend the deadline on the Equal Rights Amendment. And Liz Holtzman, who actually won her seat by defeating Emanuel Seller in an election in 1972, Liz Holtzman became the primary sponsor of the deadline extension. And part of the justification for the deadline extension in 1978 was that a recognition that the ERA had generated substantial public interest, but also a lot of misinformation, and that more time was needed in order to clear up that misinformation. And the success of the campaign of misinformation is evident if you look at the records in state legislatures during this time. A lot of that misinformation is also just leading people in the state legislatures to avoid debate on the amendment. So they can't even clear up the misinformation. They avoid debate by doing the same thing that Emanuel Seller did, keeping it bottled up in committee instead of moving it to the floor for a ratification vote. So a lot of the arguments at the time are still relevant today as we think about the legitimacy and status of the ERA deadline, which is a very current issue. Barbara Jordan also was a strong proponent of extending the deadline. And I just point to, in introducing Barbara Jordan, who was the first African-American woman to be elected from the South to Congress. She took the public stage in impeachment hearings for Nixon. And she said these words, which I think are extremely relevant to her later advocacy for extending the ERA deadline. We the people, it's a very eloquent beginning, but when the document was completed on the 17th of September, 1787, I was not included in that we the people. I felt somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in We the People. And it's important to note that this speech was quoted verbatim by Mamie Locke in the Virginia state legislature during floor debates on Virginia ratification of the ERA just in January of this year. Another example of women in later generations standing on the shoulders of women of earlier generations to give meaning to the Equal Rights Amendment. So when the ERA deadline extension was being debated, I want to point to some of the arguments that were made then, and I think are still being made now about the deadline. So one, Eldon Rudd in the House said, 3 outs and the inning is over, but they want more than 3 strikes and more than 3 outs when the game is almost over and the proponents of the ERA are not winning, right? So baseball analogy. We also had a football analogy in there from Dean Erwin Griswold, who was the Dean of Harvard Law School. In fact, he was the Dean of Harvard Law School when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of a handful of female students there. He was the dean who asked the women to justify their presence when they were taking the seat of a man. In any case, when he testifies against the deadline extension in 1978, he says, it's a little like extending the time of a football game after 14 minutes in the final quarter with the score tied and one team on the other's 1 yard line. And Barbara Jordan had a response to this, and I think this response is important and resonates today. She said, change the rules in the middle of the game. It is no game. We're talking about the rights of living, breathing, viable, working human beings, individuals. We're talking about the Constitution of the United States, something which needs to be done to make it still more perfect. It is no game. And I think this was a very powerful statement. And it matters especially when you think about all these years of women struggling for equal rights and men using various levers of power in a political game to thwart the Equal Rights Amendment, including the way in which Sam Ervin tried to get that 7-year deadline in, and including the way in which men use their power over committees to stop an amendment like the ERA from actually getting a debate. And of course, just to skip over to the present now, on January 27th, 2020, Virginia became the 38th state to ratify the ERA. As many in this audience probably know, the 36th state was Nevada in March of 2017. Illinois followed suit in May of 2018, and Virginia became the 38th state. 38 makes 3/4 of the states. And so we got that last ratification just a few months ago. And now the question remains as to whether or not the ERA can be added to the Constitution. And there is litigation going on about this question. As you can guess, the main issue right now that's holding up the ERA is whether or not the deadline can be enforced. Specifically, the 7-year deadline in 1972 lapsed in 1979, but it was extended in 1978 to 1982. And now the question is whether or not the deadline has any meaning in the face of 3 states that came decades later to finish ratification of the ERA. And as many of you probably know, there is activity in Congress right now to extend the ERA deadline. And one thing I will say about both efforts is that the things that you're seeing that are reviving the ERA, that is the 3 state legislatures that have voted to ratify decades after it was introduced, and the women who are leading the way in terms of removing the deadline. All of these things are happening because of the election of women in larger numbers to both state legislatures and to Congress. This is just a big collage, and it doesn't include everyone. I just tried to fit as many as I can on the screen, but these are some of the women in the state legislatures who have been sponsoring ERA bills and giving speeches on the floor, ratifying the ERA in Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia. And I go in my book in more detail about the things they've said about why the ERA is still needed today. And these are the women, not all of them, but some, and there are more, who have been giving the ERA new meaning by arguing in favor of extending the deadline in Congress. And as you'll see from both of these images, it includes women of all colors and ages and political affiliations. And I guess what I'd like to do is perhaps end there. I want to just get back to the place where I began, which is the argument in favor of the ERA. So one thing that you'll hear a lot is that the ERA is going to get rid of unequal pay. The ERA is going to help us fight sexual harassment and violence against women, and so forth. So the ERA, if you think about the text, just says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. It doesn't specifically take a position on any policy issue. And so a lot of what the ERA is going to do depends on the legislative history that is created. That is, what were lawmakers saying in Congress in 1970s as they adopted it? What were lawmakers saying on the floor as they ratified it, both in the 70s and in more recent history? And what were lawmakers saying when they extended the deadline? They've brought the spotlight to a lot of these issues. And a lot of these issues are not things that are going to be solved overnight right after the ERA goes into effect, because the ERA really addresses itself to governmental action, laws that actually discriminate. But I do think that the momentum of the ERA as a political force over 100 years really gives legitimacy to specific lawmaking projects on things like pregnant worker fairness and equal pay. And I think that's actually very important. The other thing I will say is that it's often argued that ERA is unnecessary as an argument against the ERA. It's unnecessary because the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment, equal protection clauses, do everything that the proponents of the ERA wanted. And to my mind, that's actually an argument for the ERA, not against the ERA, because the reason the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment do all the things that ERA proponents wanted is because of the efforts of lawyers like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the efforts of women who took the energy of the ERA and funneled it into litigation around the 14th and 5th Amendment. And what that means is that the ERA has become part of the Constitution because of the efforts of women. But if you now use that as an argument not to put the ERA into the Constitution, it's just another way of not valuing or recognizing the contributions that women have made as constitution makers. And I think that recognition is extremely important. Women do a lot of invisible work. We don't want women's work in constitution making to be invisible as well. I'll stop there and take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julie. That's amazing. That was a lot of information in a very short period of time. We've had a few questions that have been submitted so far. I'll start with the first one, and I'll just go in kind of chronological submission order. So if anyone has more questions, please use the chat box right now to submit your questions for Julie. The first question is, could you please discuss the position of the League of Women Voters on the ERA from 1945 to 1972? Is that an area that you could speak to?
Sure. So I could actually start a little bit earlier. So the League of Women Voters was the organization that morphed out of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And right after suffrage was won, a lot of suffrage organizations were trying to figure out what they should do if they continued to exist. And a lot of them formed into new organizations that worked on a variety of issues, including the National League of Women Voters. And many of those organizations became the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. And the Women's Joint Congressional Committee pretty much lobbied in Washington for legislation that they thought would be good for women. And one of the major accomplishments of the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, including with the participation of the National League of Women Voters, was the Shepard-Towner Act in 1921, very shortly after the 19th Amendment was passed. And that Shepard-Towner Act was a law that gave grants in aid to the states to promote maternal health, or rather to reduce maternal mortality and to reduce infant mortality. And so that was one issue that a lot of women's groups were working on, while the National Women's Party was working exclusively on the Equal Rights Amendment. And so, and then I think there was a debate in the 1920s about whether or not the ERA would threaten protections for mothers, including the Shepard-Towner Act, and you see that debated in Congress in various hearings about the ERA. The National League of Women Voters throughout the 1920s and the 1930s did not support the Equal Rights Amendment, even though they took positions in some of the hearings that praised equal rights guarantees for women in constitutions around the world. And I think the main issue for the National League of Women Voters, as well as for many other women's organizations throughout the 1920s, the 1930s, is that they actually supported a lot of legislation that would be helpful to women. In fact, there was a women's equality bill that was in Congress simultaneously with the ERA in the 1940s. And the League of Women Voters was in favor of a lot of the legislation, but they didn't put their weight behind the ERA, largely because of this original, highly formal understanding dating back to the 1920s that the ERA would be very rigid in operation and would just strike down every law that ever distinguished between men and women. And I believe, I don't know the exact date, it was sometime in the 1950s that the National League of Women Voters changed its position. And I think, I mean, even someone like Dorothy Kenyon, who was with the ACLU, Dorothy Kenyon also opposed the ERA in the 1920s and 1930s. She was the lawyer who argued many of the sex discrimination cases for the ACLU. And initially in the 1920s, she said the ERA would be like a blind man with a shotgun. And that was a way of saying, if you have a judge who wants to interpret the ERA in a manner that's bad for women's rights, then you're basically giving a gun to that judge. Whereas if it would be much better if the legislatures just passed laws that the judges wouldn't strike down. But even Dorothy Kenyon, who took such positions much earlier on in the 20th century, by around 1970, Dorothy Kenyon goes on record as saying she supports the ERA because they've been trying all these other things to get equality for women, including litigation under the 14th Amendment that was by then unsuccessful. And I think it was because of this evolution that both the National League of Women Voters and a lot of other organizations start coming on board with the ERA from the late 50s through the 70s.
Another complex relationship between the League of Women Voters and the ERA then in the early years. I wonder if that's rooted in some of the states' rights versus the federal rights, if that arc is kind of connected there. Anyway, I'm going to move on. There are so many questions here, Julia. We're not going to get through all of them, but we'll get through as many as we can. There was one in an introduction early enough that is, let's see. She's asking for a more broad ask about, how can we engage with sexism deniers, so specifically women who say that they themselves have never experienced sexism and therefore it doesn't exist. So do you have any pointers for engaging with the sexism deniers out there?
So I don't know if I would characterize what I have to say as pointers. But let me take a step. So one of the problems that so one of the problems that have faced the struggle for women's rights from the beginning is that generally progress is made by persuading men. And that happens because you have a constitution that makes it so. You know, you can't get an amendment without 2/3 of both houses of Congress. You could think about why it took so long to get the 19th Amendment when women didn't have the right to vote in most states, which was why they wanted a federal constitutional amendment on the subject. They had to persuade men to come on board with that. And it's the same with the ERA. And I think, so for almost every initiative, without the support of men, it doesn't really move forward. And I think one can say about Phyllis Schlafly's rise to power, what I find so interesting about Phyllis Schlafly's biography is that the story that I was telling about the summer of 1970, the ERA being in heated debate in the House in August of 1970. During that exact same time, Phyllis Schlafly was running for Congress, never saying a word about the ERA. She was running against a guy who actually voted for the ERA. Phyllis Schlafly was talking about foreign policy on her campaign. But her opponent, George Shipley, said Phyllis Schlafly should just stay home with her 6 kids and her husband and stop bugging me about my foreign aid votes. And so it's very interesting that she herself was actually subject to this discrimination in many respects. But I think she also learned, she didn't get elected to Congress when she talked about foreign aid votes and nuclear proliferation, but she became an extremely famous person, more famous than she was previously. She had some amount of fame before then, but when she became an opponent of women's rights, because I think it played into, and so it wasn't her single-handedly. So a lot of what she put into her newsletters actually came from Sam Ervin's floor speeches against the ERA. So I do think there's a dynamic by which women do have something to gain politically from being against women's rights. And I think that's something to be studied further. That is, with the 19th Amendment too, there was a national association opposed to women's suffrage. There were women, there was a group that called themselves patriots who were against the 19th Amendment, mostly women. And so I don't know, it's not really, so I'm sorry, I can't give you pointers because I don't know if bringing this out is going to make people who are inclined to deny discrimination more likely to see the discrimination. I don't know how deep the denial is, but I do think that it's just a dynamic that's worth knowing about.
Absolutely, thank you. This one's a little bit more specific. Is there such a thing as a discharge petition in the Senate?
Yes.
Okay. And then I'm just going to keep going down the list because we're running out of time. As a brilliant political strategist, did Ms. Paul provide guidance to female lawmakers like Patsy Meek, Bella Abzug, Martha Griffith, etc., on how to best proceed when combating the likes of Emanuel Seller, Phyllis Schlafly, and others? Do you know if there was a mentorship relationship between Alice Paul and some of the lawmakers that came up behind her?
So I don't think, I think there was certainly a relationship between Alice Paul and many of the women's groups. And she was around up until her death, in 1977. And she does testify in some of the hearings in the 1970s on the ERA. But I don't think that the relationship was one of mentorship between her and the women in Congress.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any stories in that space other than anytime someone went to visit her in her later years, she would ask them if they had contacted their Congress representatives recently to advocate for the ERA. And so this is a question that's a little more rhetorical. I'm not sure if anyone will know, but if I ask it and anyone on the chat today knows the answer, please feel free. It's like, how many women serving in Congress had children in the ages from between an infant and 18. I think our attendant is trying to speak to how challenging it is to be a member of Congress and raise a family at the same time. I just saw the other day a story about Katie Porter out of California. She's a single mom and she's quarantined in California, and she's been sharing what her life is like trying to be an active member of Congress while also raising her children. So do you know if there's a lot of research done about how Congress is accommodating women with children?
So I don't think there's been a lot of research on this historically, although it's something that I noticed in the work that I did for this book. That is, so if you even go back to this original suffrage struggle, a woman like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So in 1848, the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls. After 1848, where she writes the Declaration of Sentiments, and many historians think of that moment as launching the women's suffrage movement in the United States, Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually does not make it to the Women's Rights Convention in 1850. And it's actually very lucky for her that she meets Susan B. Anthony shortly after that, because it's really, Elizabeth Cady Stanton raises a bunch of kids and doesn't travel that much while the children are young. She does a lot of writing and provides intellectual heft to the organizing and traveling and speech giving that Susan B. Anthony does. And I find that story very interesting because by the time then you get Elizabeth Cady Stanton testifying in a congressional hearing on suffrage in 1878, I think her youngest child is by then grown, like around 20 years old or so. And so I do think it's actually a book worth writing about the way in which motherhood has shaped, sometimes hindered, women's ascent in politics. I don't think there's been a lot of attention to it. I think there are news stories sometimes. But I think it's also very important to consider that the women who have revived the ERA in state legislatures, and particularly in Virginia, if you think about Jennifer McClellan, who was one of the sponsors of the Virginia ERA ratification, she was, I think, the second Virginia legislator ever to be pregnant in office. And I think even Jennifer Carroll Foy, also the sponsor of the House of Delegates in Virginia, gave birth to twins while she was campaigning for her seat in the Virginia House of Delegates. I do think that the women who are leading the effort are managing to combine lawmaking with having children. And so I think we're going to see more of that, but I think as we see more of that, it's very important for historians and political scientists to actually treat it as a serious subject worth studying and systematically treating. To my knowledge, I don't know of any, but there might be. I don't know of any studies that really look at the numbers of women who have had small children while serving in legislatures.
Yeah. It's still a trend that's evolving, I think. So we hope to see more of it on the floor. So I'm going to do one more question. I'm going to edit it out. I apologize to everyone. We will get to your questions via email later in the week. This one has to do with the consistency of deadlines for that applied to amendments for ratification. So is it typical for a ratification of an amendment to have a deadline assigned to it?
So yes and no. So for the first over 100 years of the history of the American Constitution, there were no deadlines, and there were no deadlines in other amendments that you might think of as similar to the ERA, namely the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, which were 19th century amendments. The first time you get a ratification deadline is the Prohibition Amendment, which is right before suffrage. And it's highly controversial at the time, but they agree to put in that 7-year deadline. They put it into the text of the Prohibition Amendment itself, and then it gets ratified by the states. Very importantly, the 7-year deadline was proposed with regard to the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage, and Carrie Chapman Catt strongly argued against it when she testified in suffrage hearings in 1918, and then it was actually debated on the floor of the House, and it was argued, I think very wisely, that the ratification deadline was a bad idea for women's suffrage, because at the time, some state legislatures had rules that said that if an amendment that you couldn't even consider the ratification until after an election cycle. If the ratification was considered and failed, you couldn't consider it again until after another, like skipping a legislative session. And if you have rules like that, 7 years is going to go by really fast before it really has a fair shot. And of course, the dynamic that you see later on in the 70s in states like Virginia in particular. In Virginia, it's really hard to get the ERA ratification bill out of committee. So even though there's a lot of popular support and possibly enough votes on the floor to pass it, it never actually gets to the floor because of the men who control the committees. And so for a variety of reasons of political structure, I think that they were really onto something when they debated the 19th Amendment. It said, for this amendment, it's actually a really bad idea to have a 7-year deadline. But that said, after the 19th Amendment, all the other amendments that were added to the US Constitution, with the exception of the 27th Amendment, had a ratification deadline. Initially, they put those deadlines in the text of the Constitution itself, as with the Prohibition Amendment, but then they started to put it in the resolution introducing the amendment, as with the ERA. It's become a pretty normal part of constitutional practice in the 20th century since Prohibition. But that said, just because it's normal doesn't mean it's necessary.
Yeah, because Article 5 of the Constitution doesn't outline any stipulations for a timeline or a deadline to be associated with any ratification. Is that correct?
So yeah, Article 5 does not mention any deadlines, but I think it raises an interesting legal question then. If it's not mentioned, does that mean it's not allowed? Or does that mean that Congress has power over it, right? And I think that the precedents, the Supreme Court precedents, have veered on the side of thinking that the deadline is not mentioned, but Congress's power to propose amendments includes the power to determine the manner in which the adoption and ratification process takes place.
So it's important that we elect people to Congress that can make decisions that will benefit the passage of the ERA. So, all right. Well, Julie, I'm going to start wrapping things up. I just want to thank you so much for making the time and sharing your important research with all of us today. And I certainly look forward to the publication of your book and look forward to sharing it with more people in the network of the Alice Paul Institute. And on behalf of myself and Colleen Treiner and our executive director, Lucy Beard, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be hosting far more of these virtual meetups and author talks and poetry readings in the near future. So please follow us on social media so you can keep up with what we're going to be doing and how we are moving to adapt all of our programs and events to a virtual space as often as possible. So I will keep the window open for a little bit. So anyone please submit more questions or comments, and I will be sharing them with Julie. And between Julie and our advocacy committee, we will do our best to answer everything, or at least point you in the direction where you can find more answers and more ask more questions. So thank you again for joining us, and I wish you guys all a wonderful weekend and a happy Mother's Day for anyone who's celebrating the holiday this weekend. Thank you again, Julie.
Thank you. Happy Mother's Day to everyone.